A lot of other things to do, medical appointments and other appointments and family and grandkids and all of that. So for you to give up your morning to come here and listen to me, I just want you to know I don't take that for granted. Now, this could be a very dark and ominous story I'm about to tell you. Few people know how close we came to losing World War II. Churchill knew in that famous speech of his where he said this was their finest hour. He was addressing America as England struggled to survive against all odds and all alone. He said, if we fail, then the whole world will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. And he wasn't kidding. He understood what was at stake. So did Roosevelt, but I'll get to that later. So this then is the story of the threat to England, how she survived, and how she kept the rest of the world, including us, out of another dark age. And as Richard and Tony and I often discuss, once you start digging into one of these subjects, it's so hard not to go off course and talk at length about fascinating parts and parcels of the bigger picture. And the story of the great German warships and Britain's desperate need to destroy them is no exception. I could do a whole hour on the Wolfbacks or Dunkirk or Alan Turing or the sinking of the Bismarck. Hopefully my little detours will lighten the heaviness of the story a bit. I love trivia, I love movies, and I'll try to keep them short, but I do drift a bit. I hope you'll enjoy that drift, and I hope it'll make the story a little bit more enjoyable. Also, when you hear words sounding a bit strange, understand I will pronounce German as a German. German was my first language. I didn't speak a word of English until I was 7 years old, even though I was born in Chicago. So with that in mind, let me tell you the story of the Iron Sea and how the compulsion to destroy the biggest and deadliest warships ever afloat saved England and actually flipped history in World War II. And to understand why this was so important, we need to start with recognizing how the sea relates to the development of a nation state and how that country's power and influence evolves from the sea and the control of the sea, true throughout the world and throughout history. In ancient times, countries learned early on that the sea was a lot more than a food source. In fact, it was an avenue of commerce. It was how a country became rich. And because of that, countries fought countless wars to acquire land that bordered these waterways, and especially the great seas and oceans. We all know about the Viking invasions of Northern Europe, and of course into and through Great Britain and Iceland and Greenland, and even down into Newfoundland and Canada, and yeah, the United States also. Great powers were formed, like Spain and its conquests of the New World, and as we see here, France and her colonies and territories. And not as well known, but very powerful at the time, Portugal, her great navigators, Magellan and others. And perhaps even less known, Holland, the Netherlands, and all those countries, colonies around the world. And of course, the most expansive imperial power was England. And their power, these countries, in each of these points in history, was clearly acquired through their dominance of the sea. And the United States was not oblivious to this. As she grew, so did the realization of the importance of sea power. And on the 16th of December, 1907, old Teddy Roosevelt set loose upon the world his great white fleet, a force of 16 battleships, bristling with guns and painted sparkling white. Steaming out of Hampton Roads, Virginia, They began a 43,000-mile, 14-month circumnavigation of the globe with only one purpose in mind, and that was to clearly demonstrate to the world America's naval power. It was clear to Teddy and other world leaders that countries that ruled the seas could rule the world, or at least have great influence on it. And England was no exception, who by this time had replaced Spain and France and Portugal and Holland as the greatest sea power on earth. That power built an empire that, as you saw a few slides ago, reigned from Australia to Canada, from India and Pakistan to Singapore, Hong Kong, possessions all around the world. Rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. That was a lot more than a song. It became a synonym for power. And by 1914, World War I saw the influence of sea control extended into the 20th century in the modern era. Germany, with only its northern frontier having access to the North and Baltic Seas, as you see here, but no ocean, and France with three sides of his country bordered by ocean, and England surrounded by the sea, but very small in geographic area, the importance of being able to sustain a war machine and a nation's life-giving food supplies was reinforced. And by contrast, depriving countries of their access to the seas and oceans in a time of war was a strategy regularly used by adversaries since the beginning of time. Blockades were to sea warfare what a siege was to land fighting, and submarines were introduced in an attempt to cripple sea supply routes to England and France, while the Allies worked blockades through the narrow passages above Denmark, which I'll show you in a moment, and that was having a stifling effect on Germany. So to be clear here, the Germans are getting squeezed into desperation. And a year into the war, this Great War as it was called, one of its U-boats sank the American cruise liner Lusitania. And that single act brought an otherwise totally reluctant America into the war to end all wars, quote unquote. Now, as an aside, just one of my many here, U-boat is actually an English acronym for U-boot. U means Unterwasser or underwater, and boot, good guess, means boat. So a U-boat is an Unterwasserboot, underwater boat. And there's a terrific movie called Das Boot, a German movie with English subtitles. If you ever have a chance to watch that with Jürgen Prochnow, probably one of the best films to come out of Germany. So eventually Germany was defeated. It was left in economic ruin, and it was brought about as much or more from the vengeful, vindictive restraints that the Allies placed upon her at the Treaty of Versailles. Much more so, in fact, that ruin than came from the bombs of the war themselves. And desperate as the German people were, poor, uh, starving, actually, it led them to follow the siren song of a man who promised to restore Germany to the greatness that she possessed before the war. And a huge part of that passion to restore its national greatness, and totally despite the restraints placed upon it by the Treaty of Versailles, was the illegal building of a mighty fighting force across the entire spectrum of war, the Wehrmacht, which ironically means defense force, but to a German, Wehrmacht is the country fighting force, is the way that word has its meaning to a German. And a part of that Wehrmacht was the naval arm, or naval power, known as the Kriegsmarine, or War Navy, with huge battleships and cruisers such as the world had never seen. And in case you've been wondering, it's taken me a while to get there, but these are the great ships in the context of world politics at the time that we'll be discussing in just a moment. Now, to appreciate the great ships, one has to appreciate the role of England in this time and place in history. In 1939, then England's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain agreed to giving away parts of Europe to satisfy Hitler's power lust. He called that sacrifice, as you may remember, quote, peace in our time, unquote. Of course, the Nazis betrayed him and his dream. They flaunted the Anschluss, which was the annexation of a totally independent country, Austria, into the Nazi Empire the previous year, and declared the Treaty of Versailles dead and buried. And almost immediately launched an invasion of Poland. And the French and British were allied with Poland, so they declared war on Germany, and Europe was at war again for the second time in 20 years. Bolstered by a non-aggression pact with the Soviets to his east, Hitler then concentrated his full might against the West in what became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, quickly conquering everything in its path and driving the British off the European continent at the beaches of Dunkirk in 1940. A terrific movie in 2017 called, ironically, Dunkirk, by Christopher Nolan, who's the guy that was the director of the last couple of Batman movies with Christian Bale. Dunkirk, very authentic film, terrific computer graphics. And just as an aside, so you can get the picture of what is happening to England, had it not been for those little boats, what was basically a civilian flotilla sent to rescue those 300,000 British troops, England would have been defeated then and there. The first domino towards our defeat, ladies and gentlemen. But back to the story. So France and the continent allies, like Britain, they're gone. America couldn't enter the war because of isolationist restraints placed on President Roosevelt. He very much wanted to get in the war to save England. And as you can see here by this slide, by 1940, England had become an island sanctuary, the last bastion of freedom from the terror that was emerging in Europe under Nazi occupation. What the previous map didn't show was that England was in really desperate shape. The plan to seal the British fate by invasion of England, known as Operation Sea Lion, was obvious and it was imminent. They are being pounded by the Luftwaffe from the skies and were struggling to maintain an ever more slender thread of supplies from American convoys by sea. So the Nazis had a two-pronged plan to bring Britain to its knees. Bomb the hell out of them from the Luftwaffe and strangle them from the sea in these convoys. So let's look at the first part of this. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was the commander of the Luftwaffe, which, by the way, means air weapon. And he told Hitler, I can bring Britain to its knees by air power alone. Not necessarily, but that's what he told them. Now, Göring was a much decorated fighter ace from World War I. He had taken over and was the last commander of Air Squadron Jägerschwader 1, whose immediate predecessor, having been killed before Göring took over, was this fella, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, or as Snoopy knows, the Red Baron. This stern-looking gentleman on the left is Admiral Karl Donitz. He was the head of the submarine forces, and he operated under Admiral of the Fleet Erich Raeder. And Donitz told Hitler he could strangle the convoy lifeline with ceaseless U-boat attacks. Now, both these plans, the Luftwaffe and the convoy strangulation, they were designed to cripple the English will and their life supplies in preparation for that imminent invasion. Now, Hitler allowed these two to continue softening up the British, and he moved most of his Wehrmacht, which were destined for the British invasion, he moved them away from the West and put them up on the Eastern Front with Russia and Russia's Slavic allies. And then, against the advice of his war staff, he broke the peace pact with Russia, one he never intended to keep anyway, and initiated Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, an invasion of the Soviet Union that would last into the same brutal winter conditions that had defeated Napoleon's forces about 130 years earlier. Working in favor of the Germans were some brilliant generals, terror weapons like Tony mentioned in February, and technology that was quite literally light years ahead of its time. And I'll show you a slide about that a little bit later. But nullifying all of those advantages was one megalomaniac who wouldn't listen to experienced strategists and who would fail to utilize the tremendous advantages in weapon technology that the Germans possessed. So England, with her brave Spitfire pilots, are desperately hanging on over the skies of Britain. But even Churchill said later that he was more concerned about the peril from the U-boats attacking the lifeline of convoy supplies than he was the threat being countered by his brave RAF pilots in the heralded Battle of Britain in the skies over England. That effort to sustain the convoys and provide the small island nation of England with the means to keep fighting became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, largest, most complex naval battle in history. I don't like reading from a slide. While you're looking at this, I'll just touch on some of the high points. The Battle of the Atlantic, it was more than 6 years long, involved thousands of ships in more than 100 different convoy battles, and as many as 1,000 single ship-to-ship encounters over millions of square miles of the Atlantic. And again, a great standalone subject for some future presentation here is this terror being rained on these convoys and their support ships. Terrific movie came out last year, Greyhound, with Tom Hanks. It's the newest film telling the story of the Merchant Marine and the terribly dangerous convoy missions. But another great old film, if you like black and white the way I do, that depicts this history is a film called Action in the North Atlantic with Humphrey Bogart. So this might be a good point to pause for a moment and understand just how desperate England's position was. The Luftwaffe is pounding the crap out of her, and the vital threat of these convoy supplies is getting thinner and thinner as U-boats devastate the attempts from America to keep England alive and fighting. And now these same convoys were needed to extend themselves beyond England, sail over the hump of Scandinavia, in order to help sustain the Russians as they're trying to hold back the Nazis' Barbarossa invasion forces that are crushing them from their west. It was, in fact, what Churchill would call the darkest hours. And that is also another great movie that won a long overdue Academy Award for Best Actor for Gary Oldman playing Winston Churchill. Highly recommended. And it would only get worse with the terror weapons that Tony talked about last February. And while the Brits stubbornly refused to capitulate, the Americans were still a half a year away from Pearl Harbor and getting into the war in an active way. And the German U-boats were wreaking havoc on these vital convoys. The wolf packs, or Rudeltaktik, they're being operated by direct contact with Admiral Donitz's command back at Brest on the west coast of occupied France. The ability to move from widely spread locations around the Atlantic to a single location once a convoy was spotted was manipulated by the so-called unbreakable but ingenious Enigma code. Now, we've already had a briefing and presentation in here on Enigma, so you all are familiar with that, I'm sure. In the summer of 1941, there were two Polish scientists who broke the aspect of how this machine worked, the mechanics, so to speak. But it was Alan Turing and his Bletchley Park crypto geniuses who cracked the code itself. And thereafter, the surface ships that were defending these convoys would know where the wolf packs would strike, and thus they would be more effective in dealing with this horrible submarine menace. Now, this whole enigma and Alan Turing himself would be another terrific presentation alone here. But we just don't have time. But there are a couple of things I want to share with you about Turing. After he cracked this code, the Nazis were fearful that it had been broken, but they weren't quite sure. So they developed an additional wheel to the machine in 1941. You can see it's a series of wheels. I think there were 5 of them in the end. But Turing broke through that caveat as well in the summer of 1942. There's a terrific movie called The Imitation Game. Benedict Cumberbatch plays Alan Turing, tells the whole story about this guy, including how, as a closeted homosexual, he was outed and he was chemically castrated. Such were the homosexual laws in Great Britain in the late 1940s and 50s. Alan Turing committed suicide in 1954, and it took a while for his country to finally recognize him in some way that would give credit to what this man did for England during the war. His face is now on the flip side of the British 50-pound note. Okay, I know you want me to get on with the story itself, but bad as things were for England, there was a new and much larger threat to her lifeline looming across the English Channel. Donitz's plan for a stranglehold on the sea and Goering's strategy of endless bombings by the Luftwaffe from the sky in order to break the British will and force them out of the war was about to get a huge boost from the unparalleled sea power of the monster ships of Hitler's Kriegsmarine. In a plan that was tagged Operation Berlin, and departing from Kiel, Germany, in January of 1941, the 2 giant battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were able to avoid British warships attempting to intercept them, snuck through the Danish Straits that you see on the center of the map here below Norway, and made their way into the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. This force was commanded by Admiral Gunther Lütjen, who was the same Nazi who would command the Bismarck Task Force 6 months later. And during their 60-day sojourn through 18,000 miles of the North Atlantic, they destroyed 22 Allied ships before they returned to Brest in occupied France. The presence of just 2 of these monster ships and their effect on the British lifeline was frightfully clear. And worse yet, still to emerge from shipyards at Hamburg and Kiel on Germany's North Sea coast were the mega battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz, and the huge battle cruisers like Prince Eugen and Admiral Hipper. So another sidebar of sorts, the Bismarck was actually named for this fella here. Germany was, before 1871, was a collection of principalities like Prussia and so forth. Otto von Bismarck took these principalities, brought them all together, and formed the German Empire in 1871. And thus he became the first chancellor of Germany. Hitler was chancellor of Germany in the Third Reich, but this man, the guy that the Bismarck's named after, was the first chancellor of the German Empire. And a couple of more personal notes about Bismarck. Construction on that massive ship began in 1936 in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg happens to be where my parents immigrated from in the middle 1930s. It is where my grandmother lived throughout the war, where she was forced to kill her 12-year-old German Shepherd dog Rex in order to have food to survive. So devastating were the daylight precision bombings and nighttime saturation bombings that were occurring from the Americans and the British over Hamburg. Hamburg was a major shipbuilding center and home port for the U-boats, obviously then a major Allied target. In May 1941, the mighty Bismarck was about to flex its muscle by breaking out into the Atlantic and begin finishing off the remnants of the convoys left after initial destruction by U-boat Wolfpack attacks, and through that destruction by battleships, cut the final lifeblood to England, and thereby end Britain as an active enemy participant in the European theater of World War II. That's what was at stake as the Brits pondered this awesome threat to their survival. They had to sink the Bismarck. Like the rallying cry of Texans back in 1836, remember the Alamo, the rallying cry for England was that three-word phrase, sink the Bismarck. Johnny Horton here in America wrote a song, reached the top 10 on our hit lists. The battered Brits knew this was sort of like an Alamo last stand for them. And the world watched as England launched one of the greatest sea hunts in history to find and sink this great ship before it could reach the expanse of the Atlantic and do far more catastrophic damage to the lifeline convoys than Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had shown could be done in Operation Berlin. Meanwhile, back in Brest, Admiral Dönitz developed Operation Rheinübung, or Exercise Rhine. The plan to move the new battleship and her consort heavy battle cruiser Prinz Eugen into the killing lanes of the North Atlantic on 18 May 1941. And while I will briefly tell you about the hunt for and the destruction of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, as well as Prinz Eugen and the other super Nazi battleships, the turning point for the British in terms of convoy lifelines was the battle between the outgunned and outmaneuvered Royal Navy and these two great German warships in what came to be known as the Battle of the Denmark Strait. So allow me to set the stage for you here. We know what the German objective was. Get these monster Nazi capital ships into the North Atlantic in force so as to augment the U-boat destruction of the British lifeline convoys. However, the final construction of Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was not quite finished. The Scharnhorst was in need of a boiler overhaul after Operation Berlin. Gneisenau was torpedoed by the Brits while in port at Brest and was under repair there. And the refit of the two huge battle cruisers, Admiral Hippe and Admiral Scheer in Kiel, were both delayed because of RAF bombing raids there. And Admiral Lütgens wanted to wait for Tirpitz to come out with his Bismarck, but the Nazi high command insisted on keeping pressure on those British convoys. So only the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen was available to support the brand new Bismarck. About this time, the Swedes, who were supposedly neutral in World War II, spotted the Bismarck passing through the Western Baltic on May 20th, and word was passed up to the British Admiralty, whose own recon planes confirmed the sighting up here between Norway and the Danish Strait. And note the term Danish Strait. That is not the same thing as the Denmark Strait, which, as you'll see in the next slide, sits between Greenland and Iceland, nowhere near Denmark. Okay then, so why is it called the Denmark Strait, way up here near Greenland? Well, Greenland is not a country. Greenland is a territory. It is the largest island on Earth, but it is a territory of Denmark. At one point, Denmark was a major sea power also, like Portugal and Holland and Britain and Spain and France. They explored and claim Greenland as theirs, and therefore the strait between Iceland, an independent country, and Greenland territory is called the Denmark Strait. Probably Iceland calls it the Icelandic Strait, but I don't know. So I'll concede to you this is a very busy slide, and in fact, you're going to see the same slide from time to time here. I just want you to get a perspective on the route of these two Nazi warships in red and the land features around them. Note Gutenhapen, which was really Gdynia in Poland, but when the Germans conquered Poland, they just renamed the city Gutenhapen. Brest, look at Saint, you don't see Saint Nazaire here. I didn't have a way to print it on this part, but if you look at Brest, um, the port of Saint Nazaire is 100 miles or a couple hundred miles south of that. And the number of Brit ships, note that, coming from Scapa Flow in Scotland and coming up from Gibraltar, all attempting to intercept and destroy Bismarck. So a lot of ships were dispatched to patrol these likely routes that could be used to break into the Atlantic. They didn't know where they were going to go, between Iceland or Greenland, or between Britain and Iceland, or Ireland and Iceland. So two destroyers, the Norfolk and Suffolk, covered the Denmark Straits, while another group consisting of the battleship Prince of Wales and a much revered old battle cruiser, generally considered the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood, along with 6 destroyers, they cruised further south so as to try to intercept the Germans once they were spotted. The 2 destroyers finally spotted the German ships on the evening of May 23rd, but kept out of range of those powerful long-range Nazi guns, shadowing them while they awaited the onrushing Prince of Wales and Hood. But Lütgen decided to do a 180 turn on the 2 shadowing destroyers and engage them. Fortunately for them, they both escaped into the fog. But the 180 turn gave the Prince of Wales and HMS Hood that were racing to the scene, gave them time to catch up. So as dawn broke to clear skies on the morning of the 24th, the fight was on. And this became the Battle of the Denmark Straits. Note here that the Brits recognized the superiority of the Bismarck. They never intended to take her on single-handedly. They wisely waited for all that power to converge into an armada before taking on one single Nazi ship of that size and strength. And even that would not be enough in this first confrontation. Okay, I admit it. I love trivia, and I'm always going off on these little trivia adventures. The Germans have always been known for their lenses, microscopes, cameras, watches, chocolate, but they're also known for their guns. The Krupp Company built a gun called the Schwere Gustav, which is seen here. It was the biggest gun in World War II. Its barrel was over 2.5 feet in diameter. And even a larger Krupp gun called the Dora was put on the Russian front, but it was never used. As late as the 2000s, Saddam Hussein tried to obtain a German artillery gun that purportedly could fire a shell from Iraq to Israel, about 550 air miles. So back to the story. In May 1941, the Bismarck could hurl one of these monstrous shells the size of a Volkswagen more than 20 miles. So maintaining a relatively safe distance was critically important, right? At 5:52 in the morning, the two pursuing Brit cruisers closed to within 15 miles and opened fire. The Hood, now on the scene, joined in this firing but was firing at Prince Eugen, mistaking her for the Bismarck at this distance. And by the time the two British battleships had made their turning maneuvers in order to engage the right ship, the Bismarck, the Nazi warship launched a salvo that hit the Hood, penetrated her thin deck armor, and hit the ammunition stores below. In a single cataclysmic explosion, from a single mammoth shell, the Hood was blown in half. In less than 8 minutes, the old vanguard of the British Navy was gone, along with all but 3 of her 1,418-man crew. A devastating loss to the other British ships and men watching this, and to the Admiralty back in England when they got the 2-word message, Hood sunk. In 8 short minutes, the worst fears of the British leadership had come to pass. In a single salvo of Nazi power, the mighty Hood was sunk, the British Navy was stunned, the Admiralty was in shock, and worse, the Bismarck was now loose in the North Atlantic. The Prince of Wales tried to engage, actually landed a few hits, but the Bismarck only had to land a couple of her monster shells, and the British ship was so badly damaged that she had to retreat from the scene, her bridge having been hit, wiping out most of her command staff. So laying a smokescreen, the Prince of Wales limped from the scene. Now the fellow on the left here was the staff captain of the Bismarck, and not the admiral in charge, obviously. His name was Ernst Lindemann. And he urged Admiral Lütgen, chase down and finish this crippled British ship. But Lütgen, ever the obedient Nazi, followed the High Command's order to move into the Atlantic and destroy convoys. Another bad decision. Because bringing you back to this busy slide here, I can't show it to you here, but the Bismarck did not escape unscathed in this exchange. She had sustained some damage. She was leaking a lot of oil. And the problem was exacerbated because while she was in Norway, she was so rushed by the High Command to get to sea that she didn't even have time to top off her tanks. Yet another quirk, twist of fate, bad luck, hand of God? But now she couldn't even make a long Atlantic run after all. So Lütgen, as you see from the red line on Prince Eugen, ordered the Prince Eugen to break away, head to the Atlantic, do as a good little Nazi and do what it's told, while he would take the Bismarck back to Saint-Nazaire in occupied France, south of Brest, for repairs and join the Eugen later. Suffolk and Norfolk had now picked up the oil slick. They were joined by the damaged Prince of Wales in trailing the Bismarck. And here, Churchill makes his firm decision to use whatever ships were available to chase down the Bismarck and eliminate that threat from the war, even if it meant exposing a convoy. So as you can see here on this slide, in all, there's 6 battleships and battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and a partridge in a pear tree. They all begin the final chase to hunt down and sink one single Nazi battleship. And before all these ships could get to the fight, it was left to the 2 destroyers, Norfolk and Suffolk, to trail the Nazi ship along with the Prince of Wales, damaged as she was. So now we get down to the nit grit for the Bismarck. It does another 180-degree turn and faces these three trailing British ships, and they exchange fire in a brief engagement. But while this maneuver slowed her advance to Brest, France, the Bismarck was still too damn fast to be caught in time by the pursuing British armada of battleships and cruisers and crap that you saw on the last slide. Something had to be done to slow her down. I've stood up at this lectern a couple times, and I'd always end up talking about the Navy for some reason. But now I can point a finger with pride at air power, because part of the home force coming from Scapa Flow in Scotland was the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious. And it began long-distance airstrikes with torpedo bombers, very similar to what happened at Midway. Now, while there was very little damage sustained by the Bismarck or Eugen, it did result in the loss of a second boiler on Bismarck. And that, along with the oil losses, it managed to slow the big ship down even more. But the Bismarck still managed to elude and evade and was finally lost to the Suffolk radar. The radar was very elementary at that time in the early 40s. Most of the British ships now that were original part of this chase were short on fuel. They were going to have to break off and return to port. And the Bismarck had faded away. And along with it, the hopes of the British Admiralty and the prayers of Winston Churchill. But not for long. Because steaming at full speed in the general direction of Bismarck's last known position was Force H from Gibraltar and its flagship, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. And aircraft from that ship spotted the Bismarck, similar to how those torpedo bombers and stuff spotted those aircraft carriers hundreds of miles away from Midway. The British cruiser Sheffield detached itself from the Ark Royal protection screen, made quick work of getting up to the Bismarck, made contact, engaged her, and Bismarck attacked her, causing a lot of damage and death. But the Sheffield, like Prince of Wales earlier, limped away under a smokescreen. But that distraction played perfectly and allowed Victorious's Swordfish torpedo bombers to attack the Bismarck. And then, in yet another quirk, another twist of fate, another luck. I don't believe in luck. I believe in blessings, but that's me. But in one remarkable incident here, one single torpedo struck the port rudder of the Bismarck, causing it to become frozen firmly in a 12-degree port position. What did that mean? Bismarck, the mightiest ship afloat, was now locked in an unmaneuverable, wide, circling turn, which obviously enabled the pursuing British battleships to finally catch up. Battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed the gap along with heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire. And at this point, the ever-proud Nazi Admiral Lütken, realizing his fate, signaled Berlin at 21:40 hours on May the 26th evening, Schiff unmannlich, wir würden mit der letzten Schell kämpfen, lange leben der Führer, or ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell, long live the Führer. Now picture for a moment that message reaching Berlin and what it would have caused back there. Here was the prize of the Kriegsmarine, the greatest battleship on the seas, boasted over by Hitler at her launching mere months ago, about to be sunk by a scrappy navy of undaunted seamen on outclassed and outgunned ships. Wer würde es ihm sagen? In other words, who's going to tell him? That's the way I would have seen it. Sheffield now kept its distance as she awaited King George and Rodney to join in the fight. The stage for the end of Bismarck was set, and at 08:43 on the morning of the 27th of May, King George V and Rodney finally was in range, spotted the Bismarck, and engaged with their huge 16 and 14-inch guns. Unable to maneuver, Bismarck's return fire was ineffective. The distance between forces closed further, and then the smaller Dorsetshire and Norfolk came into play with their smaller 8-inch weapons. The Bismarck superstructure was destroyed along with Admiral Lütken and probably Lindemann. They don't know for sure whether he died in that explosion on the superstructure, whether he managed to crawl out of there and go down with the ship. Either way, he was killed. And by 09:31 on the morning, all of the Bismarck's guns were out of action, and the decision was made by whoever was left in charge to abandon and scuttle the once mighty Bismarck. By 10 o'clock, the King George and Rodney had fired more than 2,800 shells at Bismarck and scored more than 400 hits. It's sort of like Hotel California. They stuck it with their steely knives, but they just can't kill the beast. Rodney fired 2 torpedoes, the only time in history that a surface ship ever fired a torpedo against an opposing ship. In addition, around this time, the Bismarck's scuttle charges detonate, and she listed heavily to port. Still not down, the Dorsetshire fired 2 more torpedoes at her, one from either side of what was now a capsizing ship, and the Bismarck finally sank by her stern at 10:40 in the morning on 27 May 1941. A few days earlier, a very dark, ominous, morale-crippling message went from the Denmark Straits to London. 2 words, Hood sunk. But now, the message coming from the Denmark Straits to the Admiralty and to Churchill was 2 other words, Bismarck sunk. British ships managed to pick up 110 men before they were forced away to leave the scene because of a U-boat sighting. That U-boat reached 3 men, and a German trawler in the general area picked up another 2. But out of a crew of over 2,221 men, only 115 survived. That's a terrific movie, an old British black and white called Sink the Bismarck. Came out in 1960. Highly recommend. So now Britain had succeeded at no small cost to eliminate one of these monster Nazi ships. But Churchill was absolutely manic compulsive to get at and destroy the remainder of these behemoths that so threatened England's convoy lifeline. And remember, he felt that the threat to the convoys was even more significant than the threat posed by the Luftwaffe or V rockets, and he never wavered in his attempt to neutralize these German capital ships. Now, you'll recall from earlier that after the successful Operation Berlin, the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were in Brest in occupied France for refit and repairs. Prince Eugen joined them there after her successful foray raids following her breakaway from the Bismarck 2-ship formation. Another monster, the battlecruiser Admiral Hippe, was in Kiel, also undergoing refit after its own successful raiding effort in the North Atlantic. And the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was in the fjords of Trondheim, Norway, planning to break the back of those convoys going over the Scandinavian hump in the Arctic and Barents Sea to Russia. The blockade on Germany was working to some effect. And so the question now became, how do we attack these targets before they leave the ports? And the answer was really only one way: air power. As you can see from this slide, from the end of March to the end of July in 1941, almost 2,000 tons of bombs were dropped in 1,875 sorties by various elements of the RAF on and around these Brest ports. They also executed hundreds of mine-laying sorties off the harbor there and St. Nazaire. These operations were costly. They lost 34 aircraft, the Brits, but they pestered the German ships and caused enough damage to keep those capital ships that were there in Brest out of action for the time being. And that damage really pissed Hitler off. And he finally said, I want those assets back here in Germany. And that was no small undertaking given the heavy British blockades around France and up at the Danish Straits. Now, at about the same time that this was going on, the Tirpitz, which had been in the relative safety of the Norwegian fjords, was now seen moving south toward the Danish Straits, a very ominous threat. Another little bit of trivia here: the Tirpitz was named after the Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who had built the awesome German Navy after its meager imperial roots of the late 1800s. So the Tirpitz is moving south towards the Danish Straits, and the now decrypted Enigma code give the Brits a strong indication that the three damaged ships at Brest, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Eugen, would try to make a break for the English Channel and around the top of Denmark into the North Sea and back to the German home ports. And they were right. Now, with all the mines laid around Brest and the contingent of RAF concentration on the bombings and all that, and the fact that the English Channel is so narrow between Great Britain and the European coast, Admiral Raeder never thought that such a dash by these three huge battleships through that narrow passage was even possible. But he did as he was told, and he developed an operation plan called Cerberus. The Germans brought in numerous submarines, a large contingent of Luftwaffe, all of which was designed to help getting those three heavy ships through the narrow passage, over the Danish hump, and back, hopefully, to the safe harbors in Germany. So the Brits countered with their Operation Fuller, mustering hundreds of aircraft and ships to the area and laying even more minefields. The Nazi warships slipped out of Brest in the darkness of February 11th, 1942, and began what the rest of the world referred to as the Channel Dash, up through the English Channel along the French coast. The British effort was an absolute total failure because by noon on the 12th, the German ships had eluded the British and were well past Dover. Despite the Scharnhorst hitting 2 mines and Gneisenau hitting 1, all 3 ships, including Eugen, managed to round the strait and make it to Germany. Now, while Germany claimed Operation Cerberus a success, the ships really just exchanged one prison for another, because instead of being harassed and pummeled and bombed and whatever in Brest, they would now take beatings in their own home German ports, because Churchill's compulsion to snuff them out as a threat to England's lifeline convoys was absolutely unrelenting. A bit harder to measure, but extremely successful, was the Cerberus operation in terms of its effect on the morale of the British. Operation Fuller had failed miserably A British destroyer had been severely damaged, 42 aircraft had been lost in over 398 RAF fighter, 242 bomber, and 35 coastal command sorties, never stopping any of the three megaships from reaching Germany. British public opinion was appalled, and the British suffered at home and abroad. In fact, a leading article in the London Times read, "Nothing more mortifying to the pride of our sea power has happened since the 17th century. It spelled the end of the Royal Navy legend that in wartime, no enemy battle fleet could pass through what we proudly called the English Channel." Horrible. But Churchill never wavered. He continued to place the destruction of these giant battleships at the very top of his war priorities. So now with that in mind, let's see how those efforts turned out. The Scharnhorst came out of Kiel ready for action, but never made it to the Atlantic. Instead, it worked along with Tirpitz for a while until Tirpitz was hit so many times it was forced to go in for repairs again. So while attempting to wreck convoy war supplies headed for Russia up on the top of Scandinavia in the Barents Sea and the North Cape, she was left to fight pretty much for herself. And in one of these efforts, the Scharnhorst became surrounded by Royal Navy forces led by the battleship HMS Duke of York. And at the Battle of the North Cape, Scharnhorst was hit more than 100 times over 3 hours and finally went down at her bow at 7:45 in the evening, the day after Christmas in 1943. Out of almost 2,000 men, only 36 survived. Now again, Tirpitz was a monster ship. It was equal to the Bismarck, biggest ship ever built along with Bismarck. And the British launched 8 separate and distinct operations by air, by mini submarines, by commandos, all in an attempt to take the battleship Tirpitz out of the war, and particularly take her off the Arctic convoy routes to Russia. And as I mentioned in the last slide, they succeeded in damaging her sufficiently to send her to port for repairs. She was pummeled, harassed, bombed, torpedoed, all of which left her periodically damaged and inoperative, but still afloat. Finally forced back to dry dock for repairs from these constant RAF attacks, her fate was finally sealed in the last of these 8 efforts, these 8 operations, the last one being called Operation Catechism on November 12th, 1944. An air armada of 32 RAF Lancaster bombers caught the Tirpitz in Tromsø, Norway Fjord with minimal Luftwaffe protection and bombed the living hell out of that ship, which was already listing and badly damaged from all those other dedicated operations that were meant to sink her. She finally rolled over with her superstructure stuck in the shallow seabed there, and she remained exposed and capsized like that until salvage operations were finally completed 13 years later in 1957. So within weeks of the Cerberus operation, and having finally reached the relative safety of Germany, in late February of 1942, repeated RAF air raids on Kiel permanently crippled the Gneisenau. And while modifications and repairs were attempted throughout the years thereafter, she never again saw action. She was moved to Gotenhaben, that's the same port in Poland that was renamed when the Nazis took over, occupied Poland. And in August of 1945, the Red Army is approaching rapidly from the east. The crew took her out to the harbor entrance and sank her to use as a block ship. After the war, and like the Tirpitz, she was raised and sold for scrap. Her bell sits as a war trophy in Poland at the Polish War Museum in Warsaw. Admiral Hipa, along with Admiral Scheer, are two battleships I don't talk a lot about in this presentation, but they were also very much on Churchill's mind. The battle cruiser Hipa, which had fought beside Scharnhorst and Tirpitz in the attempts to stop the convoys going to Russia over the top of Scandinavia in the Battle of the Arctic Cape, where Scharnhorst was sunk in the Battle of the Barents Sea. Hipa also found herself bottled up in the North Sea, and eventually she was badly damaged and dry docked in her port of Kiel. And like the Gneisenau, with the approach of the Red Army, Hipa too was scuttled in May 1945, and after the war, she too was raised and sold for scrap. Which brings us to the last of the great Nazi capital ships, Prince Eugen. Prince Eugen had you could say a better ending, if you look at it that in a minute. She continued in several operations in the Baltic and around Norway. She was constantly bombed and torpedoed by the British, but she never left service. In fact, she was one of only two German capital ships captured in serviceable condition after the war. So much so that she was recommissioned as a U.S. Navy warship, the USS Prince Eugen. But once the German crew was released in order to return to Germany, the complicated propulsion systems were found to be too difficult to operate. And so this once great warship, pride of the Nazi Kriegsmarine, was towed through the Panama Canal to Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands to be used as a target in nuclear tests. And it withstood the destruction by the first bomb, and as if that wasn't enough, they towed the poor ship to Kwajalein Island, where it was targeted by a second nuclear bomb, and now in very poor condition, the Prince Eugen rolled over and capsized a couple of days before Christmas in 1946. But that wasn't quite the end of the Eugen. By 2005, the ship was found to be leaking oil significantly, and the U.S. Navy began a recovery operation and drew off more than 250,000 gallons into standby container ships. And believe it or not, that effort was not successfully completed until 2018. Her bell sits at the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. The greatest warships to ever prowl the seas were gone. What was to have been the beginning of the end of England became one by one the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, the survival of Great Britain, and Allied victory in Europe. And the characters in this phenomenal story of sea power and politics and survival. Goering became a morphine addict, swelled up to over 300 pounds. He very much wanted to be and expected to be the next Führer, but Hitler passed him over. In fact, Hitler was so angered that Goering had tried to sue for peace with the Americans at the end that he directed Goering be killed. He was captured before Nazi sympathizers could get to him and do what Hitler wanted. He stood trial in Nuremberg. He was convicted and he was sentenced to hang. But he beat the hangman by taking a cyanide capsule that someone had smuggled into his cell. Hermann Göring died on October 15th, 1946. Admiral Donitz, who led the deadly submarine wolf packs, rule tactics for the Kriegsmarine, he actually became head of the Nazi Reich as Hitler and his minions committed suicide. So as the titular head of state, he was the actual guy who formally surrendered Nazi Germany to the Allies, ending World War II in Europe. He was tried as a war criminal at Nuremberg also. He was found guilty of several of the charges against him, but not guilty of the charges that almost certainly would have resulted in the death penalty. He denied any involvement in or any knowledge of the Holocaust, but he did remain a committed anti-Semite unto the end. He was imprisoned here at Spandau Castle. This is where we sent the war criminals. He was imprisoned for 10 years, and he was released in 1956 and died from a heart attack in 1981, somewhat ironically within one city block of what had been my parents' home in Hamburg, Germany. If there's a hero to this story, it's probably this guy, Winston Churchill. In 1945, there was a general election in England. And this man, whose charisma and strength had about as much to do with sustaining the hope of the British people during those darkest hours, they voted him out of office. These same citizens he had been so instrumental in saving. But his story doesn't quite end there. In 1946, President Truman invited him to Truman's home state of Missouri and to a small college there in the town of Fulton, a school ironically called Westminster College. And it was there that Winston Churchill, now the leader of the loyal opposition party and no longer prime minister, gave the famous speech that first used the term Iron Curtain when referring to the wall that closed off Eastern Europe to the Soviets. Now, I did warn you at the beginning that I love trivia. So here's a little bit for you. In the 1600s, the most famous English architect, Sir Christopher Wren, designed and rebuilt more than 50 London churches following the Great London Fire in 1666. One of these is the famous St. Paul's Cathedral, where all the royals get married and buried, and other famous English statesmen and heroes. And a smaller, less famous church was the Church of St. Mary Aldermanbury, and it was left in rubble after constant Luftwaffe bombings. But in the early 1960s, while London was still rebuilding, Fulton, Missouri, and Westminster College bought the rubble remains of that bombed-out church in London and moved it all to America and rebuilt it there on the Westminster College campus, sort of like they did the London Bridge in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. It is there in Fulton, Missouri, on the Westminster College campus, where Churchill uttered those famous Iron Curtain words in 1946. In that small rebuilt church, designed by Christopher Wren 400 years earlier, where we have America's tribute to Winston Churchill, the Winston Churchill Memorial Library and Museum. In 1951, his Conservative Party won again. They took back Parliament, and Churchill was once again Prime Minister. And he served as the PM until a series of strokes forced him to retire in 1955. He was made an honorary citizen of the United States in 1963, one of only 8 people in history ever given that honor. And unlike many conservative British statesmen then and now, he's remembered very fondly by the Irish because he always held the view that the two Irelands should be united, and that was very much against conservative British thinking. He was then and now obviously one of the most popular foreigners that America has ever known or ever embraced. Even a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has been named after him. Winston Churchill died on January 24th, 1965. Now, as I wind this up, I just want to point out some very interesting things that come out of this story of great ships, great people, Great history, great trivia. Churchill's realization of how powerful and lethal these Nazi warships were in terms of the threat to Britain and their survival, it showed a remarkable appreciation for their lethality. He never wavered, even after the Bismarck was sunk in 1941, insisting that the other monster ships be continually attacked and put out of action. Then, as I've alluded to several times, there's the power of these ships themselves and the German engineering that created them. Consider how many Allied vessels and aircraft were diverted from other war efforts in order to end the menace of these ships. Their existence successfully diverted huge numbers of British assets in attempts to destroy them, assets that might have been used in other vital war efforts. And think of how much armament it took to take just one of these beasts out of the war and end its threat to England. They were hunted down and destroyed, saving the convoy lifelines, but they required vast British treasure in terms of ships and aircraft and men to end their threat to England's survival. And finally, there are the what ifs that emerge from this complicated story. The sort of cosmic interweaving of great ships, great men, locked in a battle of survival, and how that flipped history in favor of good guys, in favor of America. Because winning wars depends on skilled strategists, yes, but also on the men and women who execute those strategies. It also often depends on the other guy making strategic mistakes. But above all, winning wars depends on some elements of luck, as you've seen today, fate, or whatever you want to call it. I prefer to call it God's will. For example, what if in the case of the Battle of Midway, there had not been a goofy but brilliant code-breaking guy who loved crossword puzzles, seldom bathed, wore a robe to work, and had a name like a stinky French cheese, who broke the Jap code and allowed a decimated U.S. force after Pearl Harbor to know where the Japs were going to strike and surprise them at that point, Midway Island? What if Admiral Nagumo had not made a series of grievous tactical errors there that allowed our outnumbered and lesser experienced pilots to win the great victory and turn the course of the war in the Pacific theater? In fact, military historians agree that the Battle of Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific because Japan lost over 200 of its best pilots and thousands of aircraft technicians when those 4 Jap destroyers were sunk. And more germane to this subject and our story, what if one lone torpedo had not found one small rudder on the mightiest killing machine afloat, causing it to be forced to turn in circles and allowing a Royal Navy task force to catch up, hunt it down, and destroy it? And what if, after hearing my story today and Tony's a month ago about wonder weapons, what if a guy like Erwin Rommel had been the German Führer? I guarantee you there wouldn't have been a German invasion of Russia, and certainly not one that would have thrust Nazi forces into the Soviet steppes in wintertime. I can promise you, wonder weapon technology would have been exploited and not virtually ignored. There wouldn't have been Nazi religious and racist persecutions that caused so many brilliant minds to flee Germany and the conquered countries. Instead, there would have been a Nazi atomic bomb. And what if defeatists like Lord Halifax or Neville Chamberlain had been the anchor on the British ship estate instead of someone like the tenacious and inspirational Winston Churchill? And what if a hesitant and overly safety-conscious strutting peacock like Field Marshal Montgomery had been selected to lead the invasion of Europe, as many Brits wanted to see, rather than a steady, patient, and brilliant leader like Eisenhower? What if England's everyday citizens in hundreds of little boats on a rough and tumble English channel had not crossed over, and the Brits had instead lost 300,000 men at Dunkirk in 1940, quite literally their entire army? And finally, what if a hard-nosed soldier like the general at Bastogne had not said nuts when urged by the Germans to surrender? What if he had not held on against all odds until Patton could break through and save the 101st Airborne? What if we had lost the Battle of the Bulge? Patton knew at the time, and experts agree, the whole tide of the war could have changed had that happened. And General Alfred Jodl, chief of the German General Staff, knew what losing that battle meant when he uttered the famous words after Bastogne, "Das ist das Ende." So England won the battle to destroy those great Nazi warships. They survived as a nation state. The Nazi terror in Europe was ended, and America emerged as the single greatest country on earth. It took an edge, a twist, a bit of luck, a hand of God to win major confrontations. It took that then to win, and I think we can all agree that it would take that same thing today as well. But America was a different country then. We were a very different people. And that difference between what we were then and what we are today becomes clear with every snippet of news we consume, every news broadcast we watch, every action we see from Washington to Hollywood. If we agree that we will always need that edge or that break, or especially that hand of God, then the question becomes, are we still that special country, that special place? Are we still worthy of that special edge? Are we still worthy of that special hand?